our topic is global events, actually. How it impacts on Nigeria. I know we'll say at times, oh, we're far off in Africa, we're far off in West Africa. What's happening in the Middle East doesn't actually bother us. What happens in America doesn't bother us. But I'm going to tell you something. Things that happen have a ripple effect. It goes somehow, some way, it touches us. Before we get to that conversation, my guest in the studio, Faiz Muhammad, is a public and economics expert. Faiz, you can see that yesterday the Senate decided that they wanted to extend the implementation of the 2024 budget. And for me, I'm wondering, for maybe some other person out there who might not understand what that means, really, we're middle year 2025. How come we're still talking about capital projects and budget of 2024? When the year ends, doesn't it mean that the budgets for that year is moved off, or done with whatever we're doing, or go to NAMI, either move those projects now into the new projects? Kindly, help us understand that.
Well, you have to understand that we're talking about projects in 2024 that have not yet been completed.
Okay.
Now, you can, of course, add those and carry them over to the 2025 budget, but that budget has already been passed.
Okay.
Therefore, they're looking to extend the timeline for the projects that are still underway under the aegis of the 2024 budget. It's really that simple.
Okay, so not as if we're going to have to assign any more money to that. The money has already been given out for it.
I didn't say that.
Okay, he said he didn't say that. Yeah. Okay, back to our conversation today. Now, one of the major stories that we've seen come out in the last few days is the whole Middle East tension, the Israel, Iran, US situation, and something of note happened, or rather was likely to happen. We're still yet to see if Iran will go all that way. And it's about the Strait of Hormuz. And you're wondering, how does that affect us? Now, the Strait of Hormuz, is one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. And Iran's role there has far-reaching global implications. Now, it's a narrow waterway. Hopefully, we'll have some pictures up to show you what we actually mean. Between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. It's about 33 kilometers, give or take, that's 21 miles wide. At its narrowest point, Iran is to the south of it, UAE and Oman, Iran is to the north of it, then UAE and Oman to the south. Now, major checkpoint for global oil and gas shipments. Why does it matter? Close to 30% of global oil passes through the strait, around 17 to 18 million barrels. But if you can see that on the screen right now looking at you, you can just see that turn right there. That's just that thing. And that could impact the economies of the world and equally impact us here in Nigeria. Now, Iran patrols and controls the northern part of this strait, and they use it so much in diplomatic tensions when they want to go to make a point, maybe in their dealings with the US. And now, of course, they're threatening again to shut it down and cause problems. Now, back to my guest in the studio, the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran were to actually block that Strait of Hormuz right here in Nigeria, how would that impact us?
Well, the immediate effects would be a short-term gain, actually, because you would immediately see a spike in the price of oil in the world market. And that could really help ease some of the budgetary constraints within Nigeria. It could help us gain a little more foreign exchange because it would then become a situation whereby a lot of foreign markets would have to look for oil alternatives. And we'd be one of the countries who are in a position to bridge that gap. And also because the administration is currently in a position where it's trying to increase the oil production capacity of the country. So it would be, in the short term, a gain for us on a fiscal level. However, the long-term effects would be much less advantageous, simply because if this were to continue for a significant amount of time, one of the ways in which the world markets would adjust is to look for renewable sources of energy. And if that were the case, considering that 90% of Nigeria's government revenues depend on the oil market, it would lead to a situation where we are considerably less advantageous for several oil importing countries. Once again, the Strait of Hormuz, like you said, covers some 30% of the world's energy supply. That would mean that even the routes, especially if there is an actual conflict within that area, even the routes for the importation would be affected. So even our being able to import the oil safely to some of our largest import customers like India would be heavily affected. So in the long term, it is not something that would really be advantageous to the Nigerian economy.
Okay, so we're using that as a case study to now go to the conversation about global events and its impact on the Nigerian economy. Now, you said something earlier about oil prices, and this morning on the program, we saw that we are part of OPEC. Now, I know that the Brent crude seemingly went up, but the OPEC is going down. Doesn't that in any way tell a different story?
The truth of the matter is Nigeria has been underperforming as concerned its OPEC quotas for the past several years. Even currently, we are exporting at a quota that is below what we have been assigned by the organization. So even if these events were to take place, in order to really capitalize on any gains, there would have to be a massive coordinated effort from the Nigerian government to first ensure a certain level of security with regards our oil exportability, because one of the issues that foreign investors have with the oil market in Nigeria is a certain lack of reliability. And so you want to be able to eliminate the export uncertainty that already exists within the country. So the government would have to deal with that. It would also have to almost rush into the reforms outlined in the Petroleum Industry Act and really ensure a regulatory environment that is favorable for foreign investors. Typically, what you see in situations like this actually is that foreign investors leave emerging markets such as ours because of that level of uncertainty. So it would take a very strong coordinated effort from the Nigerian government to arrest this sort of issue. Okay, so now let's just have a brief understanding of how global events could impact the Nigerian economy. Now, oil price fluctuations, OPEC Plus, Nigeria depends on oil, as we've already established that. Now, conflict in oil-producing nations like Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, tensions, or plus OPEC Plus decisions directly affect Nigeria's earnings. Example is higher global oil prices can boost revenue, like our guest has said here, but fuel subsidy cost rise, straining domestic budgets. Now, the U.S. Federal Reserve interest rate hikes. When the U.S. raises interest rates, capital flows out of emerging markets like Nigeria into safer U.S. assets. He said it again now about emerging markets. This puts pressures on the naira, depletes foreign reserves, and increases the cost of imports and debt servicing. Geopolitical conflicts, these events disrupt global commodity supply chains with fertilizers, energy. We saw that when Ukraine went into war, we had a problem with bread issues because they are actually the world's largest exporter of wheat. Now, Nigeria imports wheat and fuel. So much disruptions trigger food inflation and logistics costs. Now, global health. So much pandemics shrink global demand, reduce remittances, and disrupt supply chains. Of course, we know that during the COVID-19, the world was shut down. Not just only everybody, every country in the world had some impact. There was loss, and we were not left out. Nigeria had that too. Then climate change and extreme weather. We see what the floods are doing. It's destroying a lot of things. People are losing their properties, their lives, their businesses. That's another impact on global events. Of course, global financial markets and investment trends. A slowdown in China, the US or EU affects global trade, demand for oil and foreign direct investments. Now, of course, technology. Now, what does this all mean? Let's now come back to this conversation, because we can't say that, oh, we're just somewhere in the western part of the African continent, the very beautiful black continent, proud to be a Nigerian, proud to be African. But we can't say that, oh no, we're shielded, we're shitted, because oh no, it's not happening to us. That thing we do in Nigeria during elections, oh, it's not my people. But then after a while you see that these things come to touch you. Now, how vulnerable is the Nigerian economy? Very. The truth is that we are very vulnerable to external shocks, mostly because, well, for two reasons really. The first is because we're an import-dependent economy. So a vast majority of the goods and services that come into this country do so either via foreign exchange or through international partners. In situations such as this, well, hypothetical situations such as this, you have a situation where foreign investors, especially portfolio investors, would look at Nigeria with extra caution. The volatility of the naira especially would be something that they would look at and consider whether or not Nigeria would be a strong investment destination. Now, if they were to pull out or be more cautious, that puts more pressure on the naira because it means reduced foreign exchange. Reduced foreign exchange now means it's much harder to import goods into the country. That leads to inflation across the country. Inflation across the country affects every single sector: telecommunications, agro-processing, education, healthcare. There is no sector that's not affected. So really, one of the strongest arguments for domestic production both production and refinement of oil is to really shield us from all these external shocks. It's also important that Nigeria's economy becomes as diversified as possible, because having the nation's finances so tied down to the oil market means that even a little bit of volatility makes it difficult for us to meet our targets from a budgetary perspective.
Now, you mentioned diversification. Do you think it's something we need to start taking quickly, start working on it faster, so that this global economic situation will not casualties in it?
Well, certainly, I think any government of the day would argue that that is something that has been happening for at least the past 20 years. But the truth of the matter is that investment into the country's different sectors, whether that has to do with manufacturing or agriculture or telecommunications, requires a concerted effort from the government that also requires large capital. And at times of economic downturn or economic volatility, it's much more difficult to find that capital or for the government to turn its attention towards long-term investment. You see it even now with the current administration being focused on really short-term gains of how to stabilize the naira long enough that Nigeria is able to meet its debt obligations and also service the budget to the best of its ability. That is something that we have been doing consistently for at least the past 12 years. It is not really going to pay dividends in the long run, because without putting in the necessary regulatory frameworks, reform strategy, and investment potential into different sectors of the economy, what ends up happening is we're servicing debt that comes back as higher debt because we're still going to borrow again. Being dependent on the oil industry is what causes this. So investment into different sectors is paramount. The government is doing so. Whether or not it's doing so at a commensurate rate with what the country needs is an open question.
How best and do you think they were really prepared for a world that is less reliant on oil?
Nigeria is not prepared for a world that is free of the need from oil exports.
Just hold that thought. Let me take it to the broader scene. Is the world in itself ready for less reliance on oil?
The entirety of the world, no. But the fact of the matter is, if the oil market was to slow down, or there were to be a cut off in supply to a certain degree, there are countries who would be able to weather the storm. The United States and Saudi Arabia, for example, have vast oil reserves, so much so that it would take several decades before their energy needs would really drop to a concerning level. Countries such as China have been very, very serious about finding alternative energy sources, and to a certain extent they have been successful. Electric vehicles, for example, are the #1 selling vehicles across the nation in China. So they're less dependent on energy in the same way that we are. We're in the unenviable position of being an emerging economy that is also an energy exporter and then a net importer, which means that the vast majority of our needs are met by external actors. You see that even in things as simple as healthcare. A good example of an international event that has affected Nigeria's economic output is the freeze, or should I say the cut of USAID, USAID funding to most of the world. Around 2 billion naira that used to be appropriated into health across the country has simply disappeared. And because of that, you see a situation whereby the Ministry of Health has had to realign its priorities for the entirety of the year. $2 billion is a massive amount of money.
2 billion or million?
2 billion.
Dollars.
Billion USD.
Here in Nigeria?
Yes, has completely disappeared. And the vast majority of it went into healthcare programs, HIV prevention, malaria prevention, maternal health, all of that has disappeared. And so that has affected the efficacy of the health sector across the country. So it's very important that Nigeria finds ways to become self-reliant to a certain degree. No country can be 100% self-reliant. But it's important that Nigeria finds ways to do so. Currently, we're not in a position to weather external shocks to that level if they were to happen.
Oh, well, we could have continued the conversation and delved in more into the discussion. However, time is not our friend right now. We need to leave the studios. Thank you so much for being on the program this morning, for joining us, giving us your insights on the global events, the impact on the Nigerian economy.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Faiz Muhammad. That's our economic and public affairs expert speaking to us today. For more of our news programs and documentaries, follow us on our social media platforms and on our YouTube live stream. I've been your host this morning, Chiamaka Nwafor. Same place, same time tomorrow. Bye for now.